Contrary to more popular opinion, some have postulated that the pyramids, though indeed part of funerary complexes, were not themselves intended as tombs. Evidence consists primarily of the fact that no pharaoh's bodies were entombed within the pyramid's structures, but rather underneath them in subterranean chambers. The exception is Khufu's pyramid, the largest and first built of the three Great Pyramids. In this case, the pharaoh's granite sarcophagus was found in the king's chamber, since the underground region was unfinished at the time of his burial. However, the sarcophagus is empty. To this day, Khufu's remains have never been found. One theory for this is that the body was taken by looters, while another theory involves evidence of a yet unexcavated hidden chamber, which may contain the missing pharaoh's undisturbed remains. There are, of course, other more technological, non-funerary theories for the pyramid's functions, but the most likely consensus from those more familiar with ancient Egyptian spiritual beliefs is that the true original function of these incredible structures were as resurrection machines. As evidence, they point to the indigenous Egyptian name for pyramid, which is Mr, pronounced as mir. The literal translation of mir is place of ascent or place of rising. This is because the pyramids were believed to have been a way for the deceased pharaoh to ascend to the stars, a literal stairway to heaven. It says here that, from the top point of the pyramid, it was thought that the soul would travel to the afterlife of the field of reeds, and if it so chose, could easily return to earth, to the highest pinnacle of the pyramid, or a lifelike statue of the king, serving as a beacon that the soul would recognize. We might imagine this elevation of the entombed pharaoh to the heavens to be similar to the levitation of the deceased and entombed King T'Challa in the movie Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. The pharaoh and his belongings would be prepared so that he could ascend to the afterlife in the stars, becoming an ancestor and celestial being, or god, who would protect and bless the people who were his loyal subjects in life. Such blessings would include protections from evil, protections from enemies from within and without, as well as the continued assurance of the annual flooding of the Nile. So in the Egyptian mind, it was of utmost importance that the pharaoh's ascension take place, as it meant having a powerful celestial advocate in the heavens. Though this may sound like a purely abstract spiritual concept, we must understand that the ancient Egyptians did not separate the spiritual world from the physical dimension, at least not in the same way that we do. But as the construction of the pyramids was such a monumental effort, we might wonder how the Egyptians were so certain that such a machine would work. Was there evidence in their own experiences and observations beyond the philosophical to prove to their satisfaction that a person could be resurrected and lifted into the sky? To this, perhaps we should look back to the Egyptians' experiments in bioelectricity. It says here that ancient Egyptian writings on papyri record the use of the electric fish to relieve pain 4,700 years ago. Later records by Pliny and Plutarch also report the Egyptians' use of electric eel to treat joint pain, migraines, melancholy, and epilepsy. The Egyptians reputedly used the electric shock from electric catfish when treating arthritic pain, but they would only use small fish, as a larger fish tended to generate electric shock from 300 to 400 volts. The Egyptians depicted the fish in their myriad paintings and elsewhere, its first known depiction being on a slate palette of the pre-dynastic Egyptian ruler Narmer around 3100 BC. During their exploration into the effect that high-voltage electricity has on biological tissue, they may have discovered what was known in the late 19th century as galvanism and animal electricity. It says here that in addition to being the term given to physicist and chemist Alessandro Volta's discovery that an electric current can be generated by a chemical reaction, It also came to refer to the discoveries of his namesake, Luigi Galvani, specifically the generation of electric current within biological organisms and the contraction and convulsion of biological muscle tissue upon contact with electric current. While Volta theorized and later demonstrated the phenomena of his galvanism to be replicable with otherwise inert materials, Galvani thought his discovery to be confirmation of the existence of animal electricity, a vital force which gave life to organic matter. The story of Frankenstein may come to mind here, where a corpse is reanimated with the use of high-energy electricity. So as we can see, there were even people as recently as the late 1800s, during early modern electrical experimentation, who seriously considered the idea that electricity could revive the dead. And so the question is, did the Egyptians come to a similar conviction during their own electrical experimentations with human and animal bodies? As the old saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. Did they believe that the Pharaoh, or at least his essence, could be resurrected by some type of high-energy process? If the limbs of dead animals could move with the application of electricity, then would it have seemed plausible to them that much larger amounts of energy could bring a corpse back to life? Essentially the ancient concept of Frankenstein. And not only resurrected, but propelled from the bottom of the pyramid, up through the pyramid, and into the heavens, where he would become a full-fledged god. This apparently is what the pyramid shafts were originally designed for. The king's soul would pass through these shafts and be launched into space. These shafts are very important. While the Great Pyramid did have multi-purposes, its most important function was as an interdimensional teleportation device, also known as an ascension chamber. During this time, some very advanced souls had learned how to create wormholes in space-time to connect with the wisdom of the universe. They were like runways to a cosmic airport for those who had mastered light transfiguration, or the ability to send their ethereal bodies to higher dimensions. We could imagine the perspective of the deceased Pharaoh's soul during this journey, traveling through a dark pyramid shaft before being bathed within the all-encompassing light of the starry sky or the sun at the end of the corridor. This would be akin to the familiar phrase, the light at the end of a tunnel, described by many who have had near-death experiences. The light at the end of a tunnel is one of the hallmarks of near-death experiences and appears to cross cultural lines. People during the time of ancient Egypt most certainly had similar experiences, and so perhaps the pyramid shafts directed towards the stars was a physical attempt to realize or assist this already transcendental phenomenon. Is it possible that this ethereal resurrection and journey was combined with the idea of a more corporeal resurrection, such as with the idea of Frankenstein? This might follow as physical, worldly goods were buried with them. Certainly the former is true, as directions to the stars were even provided to the traveling soul. It says here that these directions also tell the journeying soul how and when to push through to traverse specific higher dimensional areas of the cosmos. This is not as surprising as it may sound. The ancient Egyptians were big on how-to instructions to assess the stars even after death, as evidenced from inside funerary coffins. So 3 different powers were to be at work here: resurrection, levitation, and teleportation. The king's physical and or spiritual essence would be resurrected, levitated from the subterranean chamber through the shafts into the apex, where it would then be teleported into the spiritual realm of the gods. But what were to be the working principles behind these incredible processes? In our last discussion, we looked at the possibility of the Egyptians developing their own theories of quantum mechanics, particle physics, and vibrational physics. With this in mind, We have to return to the definition of mirror as the place of ascension, rising, and elevation, or what we would call levitation. If the Egyptians did in fact have their own highly developed theories of quantum mechanics and particle physics, as hypothesized in my recent video, Ancient Egyptian Quantum Theory, then could the pyramid have been built to achieve these feats using its now well-known unique electromagnetic and acoustic resonance properties? Is it also likely that the Egyptians were aware of the negative mass property of phonons, a property we've also discovered in modern times? It was once believed that phonons had no mass or negligible mass, similar to photons. But apparently phonons do have mass, but of a unique type which grants a type of buoyancy within a gravitational field, hence the term negative mass. In other words, rather than falling in a downward arc as normal particles with mass, they instead arc slightly upwards as they travel through a medium, whether that medium be solid, liquid, or gas. We also discussed John Ward Keely's claim that minute particles of a vibration source are actually lost via dissociation into its surroundings during the act of sound production, although it would be a question as to whether or not these derivative particles would also possess negative mass as phonons do. But if the Egyptians did have knowledge of the gravity-defying properties of phonons and perhaps other particles, then did they arrive at the notion that bombarding the pharaoh's mummy with these high-energy particles would not only resurrect him, but also grant him a type of levity? And were the walls of the pyramid designed to reflect the generated sound, creating powerful standing waves which could focus and generate a strong levitation force? A force strong enough to raise the pharaoh's newly buoyant physical body, or perhaps its essence, from beneath the pyramid to its apex, where it would then be propelled into the heavens. This in effect would be a megalithic version of a modern containerless processing system using acoustic levitation. It has been said that certain notes sounded within the king's chamber generate a resonance so strong that it feels like waves of water passing over the entire body. Acoustic engineer John Reed said that the effect was particularly strong while lying within Khufu's sarcophagus. If this is true, then we can only imagine how powerful this acoustic force might have been after a newly constructed pyramid, complete with its original tuning and its outer casing stones. If sound was indeed used to create the pyramids in any way, then it certainly could have been used to operate it. Again, this may sound absolutely crazy to us, but we must remember the Egyptians had a society which was a combination of not only physical technology, but also mysticism and spirituality. There was no separation of church and state as we know it. If they were truly convinced that their continued existence depended upon the pharaoh's resurrection and ascension, then perhaps it would enable us to better understand the sheer motivation to be fully willing to take on the colossal task of building such an imposing structure. It might not have just been what we would call an abstract spiritual resurrection, but to them a very real one based on their own observations of the ability of external energy to grant the dead the appearance of regained life force. Of course, it's not exactly the same as touching a high voltage source to biological tissue, but we do know that high energy fields can indeed exert powerful effects even without direct physical contact. This was indeed the basis of Nikola Tesla's work during the latter half of his career. It may still be a question, though, of how the Egyptians could conclude after the king's burial that the machine actually worked or not. But as long as the Nile continued to flood annually, granting its life-giving properties to the region, and as long as the sun returned each morning, then it may have been enough confirmation to them of the success of their efforts. If anything, it makes just as much sense as sacrificing animals and people to appease the gods. Again, we have to view this from the perspective of a people with a great practical knowledge of the physical world that was thinly veiled from a very rich spiritual tradition. We need but look to the Pharaoh's actual burial for further clarification of this, as it involved material, magical, practical, and symbolic elements. Material elements included his mummified body, food, clothing, statues, and on very rare occasions, even servants who were sacrificed and buried along with him so that they could continue to serve him in the afterlife. Presumably, either the physical materials themselves or their ethereal counterparts or essences would also be transported to the next world. The magical and practical elements included the spells and the aforementioned directions to the stars, respectively, and sacred symbols representing majesty and power over life and death composed the symbolic elements. So it would follow that these elements would be blended with their science as well. It was apparently all skillfully brought together in a cohesive system of magic, perhaps what some would even classify as techno-magic. Though just superstition to us, to the early Egyptians, magic was very real, and it appeared to be very much based on notions of cause and effect, and therefore a considerable degree of logical thought based on their convictions and beliefs. And so was the Great Pyramid a machine after all, but just not quite in the way that we think? A machine which embodied both physical and metaphysical concepts? But so much time and effort were required to construct the pyramid for what would be a singular event of resurrection, which will probably be over fairly quickly. And so another question is, what was the plan for the pyramid at the conclusion of this event? It is highly doubtful that the plan was complete abandonment of the great structure. Rather, it likely continued to operate as a sacred space for a time, and probably other metaphysical activities such as transcendental meditation. Perhaps later, it may even have been utilized for more earthly purposes, such as a pump or a power generator. Concerning the latter, the core idea of the Giza power plant, as theorized by author and engineer Christopher Dunn, does at least sound plausible. This would theoretically have enabled the pyramid to function as a system of wireless power transmission, analogous to Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower. But instead of using electricity from a power station, as in Tesla's design, the Giza power plant is theorized to have converted the vibrations of the Earth into electromagnetic energy, which could then be broadcast for power or long-distance communications. Another little recognized fact is that it definitely served as a type of glorified sundial, which not only told daily time, but also enabled the Egyptians to recognize the solar year by signaling the solstices and equinoxes. There have even been heated debates on either side of the argument for the pyramid being used to store grain at some point. This is actually not too far-fetched, as pyramid shapes have been used in what is called energetic agriculture. This variation of agriculture makes use of various principles including electricity, sound, sacred geometry, and magnetism, among others, to energize seeds, seedlings, and mature plants, as well as to ward off pests naturally. Energetic agriculture is, of course, dismissed as pseudoscience by the mainstream, but many horticulturists swear by its techniques and principles. This proposed multi-purpose recycling of the pyramids seems plausible, as the ancients of various time periods will often incorporate what was ancient even to them into something new, a process known as adaptive reuse. Today we tend to almost casually discard the old, along with the mystical and spiritual, as we advance technologically. As technology grants us more and more power over our environment, we tend to shed some of these concepts, though the core ideas may still remain. But the ancients seem to have adopted a slightly different approach, as Egypt especially seemed to be the ultimate blend of scientific and technological progress, along with ancient concepts of the spiritual and paranormal over most of its 3,000 plus year history. When the ancient Nubians from Kush took over Egypt in the 700s BC, they didn't just do away with the ancient traditions and structures. Instead, they ushered in a Nile Valley Renaissance, reestablishing the flailing religion, reinvigorating and repairing the ancient structures, and building new ones from Egypt proper, all the way up to their origin of Kush. They also expanded Egypt's territorial rule to the farthest extent ever since the New Kingdom. In light of these realizations, it would certainly follow that the pyramid could have begun as an ancient resurrection concept, later being repurposed as a type of early power plant, with its shape and certain structural features eventually becoming a prototype and cultural mainstay for the design of later temples, though the original concept and function may have faded somewhat in favor of new ones. As we can see, this adaptive reuse concept could potentially add validity to the various and widespread theories regarding the functions of the pyramids. Perhaps the pyramids could have served all of these purposes. The Black Panther movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe once again provides a good visual conception of this blend of the ancient and progressive with the fictional supercity of Wakanda. Here we see a fascinating blend of nature along with advanced technology, of ancient ideas along with new innovative concepts, and even old indigenous structures such as grass huts, along with first world style skyscrapers, all harmoniously occupying the same space and all seamlessly blended into an aesthetically pleasing whole. It is very derivative of futuristic green cities designed by innovative civil engineers, but with the addition of adjacent and embedded ancient iconography. Also on display are advanced weaponry along with protective power totems and archetypes of fearsome animals, the latter which is similar to those of Egypt, and which, similarly to Egypt, embody a very long and unbroken ancient tradition. Traditions can last for millennia, some carried down to us even today, such as ornamental burial and coffins, which are essentially less glorified versions of Egyptian sarcophagi. Though we may think otherwise, Egyptian beliefs and practices are not as foreign as we might think. Even today, there is an undeniable blending of reality and fantasy. For instance, we can see how characters in movies and TV shows can become major cultural icons and heroes, even though they don't actually exist. Entire fictional worlds are intricately crafted around these characters, in which people often engage in highly fueled debates over. When the characters are especially relatable, they can often grant their adherents an outlet and sense of power that they otherwise wouldn't experience, often evoking passionate emotional responses when these characters are questioned or criticized. Some of these fictional characters can, in some ways, exert as much influence in society as politicians and industry leaders. And actors have at times spoken of fans being unable to separate the artist from their art, with them often being the targets of admiration or even outright hatred that is entirely undeserved. Reality and fiction at times being blended so well that the characters are not fully separated from the actors and actresses. But of course, this doesn't mean that the fans suffer from any form of clinical level delusion disorder. They are indeed very aware that performers are playing fictional characters, but nevertheless, the emotions and concepts evoked are very real. It is interesting that even quantum physicists have such theories of reality as being a product of subjective observation. In these examples, we can see the strong similarities to earlier cultures, though we might pride ourselves in being able to better make the break with our parallel symbolic worlds when needed. Ultimately, even though much of Egyptian philosophy and spirituality might seem almost nonsensical to us, the reality is that they wholeheartedly believed in these concepts, and they believed that the very existence of their civilization depended upon the pharaoh's successful journey to heaven. And we know that strong beliefs can at times enable people to achieve surprising feats of mental and physical ability, which can seem almost supernatural. Did this property enable ancient peoples to develop the agency, tools, techniques, and science necessary to create structures that we would have difficulty recreating even today, thousands of years later? I believe that this is indeed what we see all over the earth, but is probably particularly evident in the ancient Nile Valley. What if ancient Egypt had continued for another 3,000 years? What would such a culture look like and be like? And what could it offer the world? Perhaps this is one of the many reasons that Egypt continues to fascinate us so. More videos and experiments will be forthcoming. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned.